From the RSNA, this is the Radiology Artificial Intelligence Podcast. My name is Paul Yee, and I'm a radiologist and co-host of the podcast.
And my name is Ali Tejani, and I'm a radiologist and co-host of the podcast. Each month, we dive into the hottest topics in radiology AI and talk with leading experts, thought leaders, and movers and shakers in the field.
Welcome back to another episode of the Radiology Artificial Intelligence Podcast. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce two special guests, Dr. Bardia Khosravi and Cody Savage, our two newest members of the podcast team. Can you guys say hello?
Hi, everyone. I'm Bardia. I'm Radiology AI TB and now stepping up as a assistant podcast editor.
Hey, I'm Cody Savage. Similar title, similar role. So happy to be here.
And I'm thrilled to have you guys because, one thing with the podcast, it's a lot of fun, but man, is it a lot of work. Ali knows from working with me the past couple of years, just the amount of time it takes, not just to schedule guests and think about content, but actually recording the podcast themselves. And sometimes, Ali, I don't know about you, I wish I could clone myself or clone you and have like a whole team of podcast hosts. You know what I mean?
Let me start out by saying just how great it is to have both you, Bardia, and Cody with us on the podcast today for this episode. And Paul, I know what you mean. I think we definitely need more Pauls. More Ali's wouldn't hurt. I definitely would get more done around the house. But that being said, we definitely need some support these days, especially as we start seeing some great content coming out in the journal, in just the domain of AI. As we're seeing just a really continued, right, this exponential growth in technology of innovative use cases, applications, there's just so much to talk about. And then when we have these big panels, it's often tough to coordinate schedules, just getting down to the logistics, to the point where it would be pretty nice if someone could help us fill in sometimes. I wonder if there's any solution these days that can augment our workflow here, Paul, anything that can help us out.
Well, I don't know about someone, but maybe something, depending on how you look at it. Yeah, so it's funny you mentioned that. A few months back, there was this thing that came out from Google called Notebook LM. And it was really pretty interesting because it was making its round on Twitter. People were using it to basically ingest articles, video, websites, and use generative AI to make summaries, give you like a Reader's Digest version or a bullet point. But the other cool thing was there's this audio generation format where you could actually create a podcast that was complete with conversational style, with two different hosts, even different genders of the hosts. And yeah, it was pretty interesting. So I think a few of us here actually independently was playing around with it to see how it does with our articles from, let's say, Radiology AI or Radiology. And the results are pretty interesting. I don't know what your recollection was. That's kind of how I remember it.
It's one of those trends, right, where you see a brand new tool and you really just want to try it out. And you're initially, at least personally, when we played around with these, you have this rush of emotion, just trying to comprehend what you're hearing, what you're seeing. And then once that initial aura of excitement settles down, you start to realize more critically, right, about things that are working well, things maybe not so well. But Cody and Bardia, you are no stranger to some of these AI-generated podcast tools. Tell us more about your thoughts. Have you played around with these tools? What do you think? What are those initial reactions that we're feeling?
Yeah, I've messed around with a few of these, listened to a few non-human generated podcasts. And the first impressions is super impressed with just how clean everything sounds. It sounds very natural. If you only had to hear a little small excerpt, you'd hardly even be able to tell that it wasn't a real podcast. And really, after I listen to a few, I'm left with, there's some like glaring kind of obvious things, kind of trends that you notice, but I'm also just interested in seeing just with how rapidly AI progresses in general. What are the problems that kind of persist and what are the ones that get easily solved? Like, you might have thought that like PhD level reasoning would be like something that would take years for like LLMs to solve. And I seem to really combat that pretty handedly, but hallucination, still a huge problem that haven't really been quite dealt with. I'm really interested to see where that lands as far as the podcast world.
Yeah, I remember distinctly the first day that Notebook LM came out, and Twitter was full of everyone, including me, sending their article to Notebook LM, downloading the podcast and sharing it like that. It was it is still a great medium of just creating podcasts as a learning and as an educational tool and just spreading the word. Everyone is commuting, I don't know, 10, 20 minutes probably every day to work. And then this is a much better medium than just reading a paper. And it gives a good summary, but this is TBD how good it is and how factual it is. As Cody was mentioning, the hallucinations of the at least audio generation models or the whole framework is not well assessed. And we don't know if there are hallucinations there. And it is actually harder, I guess, when you have these such realistic voices talking to each other, creating the podcast. And then when they state something, you will take it granted and say, okay, yeah, this is a fact probably. So I think this area can be a little bit challenging to explore, I guess, at least as a listener. What do you think, guys?
I'm thinking about the first time I experimented with Notebook LM, for example. And once that initial excitement and that wow factor of, I can't believe this is possible, settled down, looking more critically, I think there were a couple things that work well to start out with. First one is it's really effective at taking complex information and not just condensing it, but really, I think, translating it terms that even those without technical experience in that topic can understand. Now, it also makes everything sound exceedingly positive. I still remember we talked to Chuck Kahn about his initial experiences too, and he always talks about how his first paper sounds so much more exciting, right, when submitted to these models. And I think, personally speaking, I've had a couple of similar experiences where it can take some of the more very technical information that may be really exciting for someone who has a vested interest in that content. It makes it sound like it's the most exciting, shiny new toy in the world, right? Again, but still at a level where if I had no background in that technical knowledge, I may come out actually understanding something. Now, whether or not it's true or not, because of the hallucinations, is a separate topic. But it gets you really excited about what you're listening to.
Yeah, to try to piggyback off of that a little bit, kind of a thought that I had just listening to you both is the things that we've learned just, being in the world, growing up, talking to people, and how we understand what the people are saying. We listen to how they speak about things, how they're like their emotion behind the voice with different things. And you touched on the excitement of what they're saying, and it's normally when we talk to people, that's kind of like how we know to assign value to what they're saying and pay attention. But also something else is you can usually tell when somebody's a little uncertain about what they're saying. But these podcast hosts tend to never really sound uncertain. So you can kind of get misled into not knowing which parts of it are actually hallucinations or false or things like that. I'm really interested to see how that gets tackled or if it's even something that people are targeting right now.
Yeah, so I think all of this is super relevant, super astute observations. But just for our listeners, what were some of the things that you observed? I mean, we're talking about hallucinations, we're talking about maybe some factual inaccuracies, but from what I recall, some of them were pretty funny.
One of the most funny experience that I had with the Notebook LM was how much it tries to dumb down the subject and bring up very mundane examples. So for example, comparing, I don't know, I think it was a mammogram or breast screening study and bringing up a car example of if you're riding a car, doing something very mundane. I mean, it was very cool that you can compare these two in some ways and it's, wow, how are these two subjects related to each other? And say, yeah, okay, now that you explain it, it is kind of makes sense, but you don't need to bring up examples for me. So tailoring it to my knowledge would be, I think, something that how the model tried to explain everything and dumb down everything. It was one of the, great experiences I had with the model. This works very well with the subjects that I don't know much about, and it gets very interesting, I think, for someone who is not an expert in a field.
Bardia, just really quickly, some of us needed to do that. So please, let's not go changing the model dramatically. Just give those examples there. No, I'm just joking, but I know exactly what you mean. I think there's still a concern about really knowing who your audience is, right? Being able to tailor the content. I mean, Paul, when we make these podcasts, and now soon when Cody and Bardia will do the same, kind of have an idea of who your audience members are so you can tailor the way you talk about things, the specific examples you bring up. But Bardia, fantastic point. I think you're absolutely right that there is a need to maybe prompt or fine-tune model to a specific audience or a listener.
No. I was just going to say that's something that's really interesting about just large language models and generative AI in general is these models, when they first come out, they might be limited. Notebook LM, when it first came out, is literally click and go. You got one podcast that was generated. You didn't really have much say in the matter for saying, hey, I want this to be tailored to the level of a radiologist or to the level of a person without medical background. But just a few weeks after that, there was the option to start doing prompt engineering. So just something I think is really interesting, that what we might have experienced now might not be the case just a few weeks from now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I kind of think about, how these models are kind of trained from the very start. Like, I'm sure a lot of these ones had reward models that were built on human preferences, but I'd highly doubt that they have like a slew of radiologists giving their preferences on podcasts to train the initial reward model in order to change this thing. So I think people really take it into their own hands, with prompt engineering, given really specific types of prompts for it, and also maybe even just their own preference data for these things can really make it more fine-tuned to something that's much more equipped for your listeners, and actually create, just like maybe even another little micro environment where all these people have their own little pathways and their own podcasts and stuff that can really suit your interest.
Another thing that comes to mind is the scope, right? So we're talking about, Paul, you mentioned now an ability to bring in a prompt engineering framework even. I think that could be really helpful for things like just setting the scope. I don't know about y'all. I want to hear about your experiences too. The times that I've experimented with some of these earlier models, I'm having a lot of tangents, right? And this is really an issue with the click and go style podcast generation. I mean, you're listening to a discussion about mammograms or radiographs or some novel application. And all of a sudden the analogy goes into scanning mummies at a museum or taking fossils, right? And scanning those too. And it's one of those things where I don't not appreciate it. It's pretty interesting. I often learn things I didn't know. Again, whether it's hallucinating or not, I wouldn't know because I'm not an archaeologist, right? But I wonder if there's a way to tighten the scope to make it more relevant, because I can imagine these tangents can get pretty extensive sometimes. Any experiences with those tangents or anything memorable that made you stop and really think hard about it?
Just one of the first things I saw was just this banter. I found it entertaining at first, but there'd be this kind of like joking kind of style, the two hosts poking fun at each other. But after a while, it just became really repetitive. And that to me was pretty interesting, that things that might be seeming human like kind of became like telltale signs. Like, this is totally AI generated. This is totally Google Notebook LM generated. And, dare I say, it kind of started to get a little annoying.
Yeah, I kind of felt the same way where, it was really hit or miss. Sometimes they joked about these things that made it more engaging, gave us a nice little break to kind of hear the more dense informational content that you just listened to. And then other times they would be doing that and they would really going back and forth, going really into detail about this thing that's really like simple and things you don't really care about. And then they like briefly gloss over something that was actually an interesting point you wanted them to talk more about that you feel like human people would probably do, but then they just gloss right over it. And you're like, I really wish they would have went down that rabbit hole and they didn't.
But I don't know if you guys tried the new version. In the new version, you can just raise hands and then ask questions from the hosts, which I think that's very cool feature. I tried it a couple of times, but I invite you all to try it. It is cool. It turns a passive learning experience into an active one, which I really like, which is something that is very scalable and humans probably can't do in that scale. But just try it. It's something cool.
Hey, don't get me wrong. I think this technology is astounding. I think that it is moving so fast. And the interactive piece is, like you said, it's super cool. I was just playing around with ChatGPT on my phone with the voice command and how you can use the video and scan your room and it'll tell you what it sees. So it's just like a wild ride that we're all in for.
I was going to say, Bardia, so raising hands, asking questions. Are we talking about teachers uploading curriculums to this platform and just hitting play?
One funny issue with that is that when you raise your hand and ask a question that is supposed to be covered later, they say, "We will cover that later. Just hold your questions for later."
Well, I'm a little astounded. I'm kind of at a loss of words that it can actually.
But do they cover later, Bardia?
I don't know. We don't know that it was actually intended to be covered or not. They will cover it later, of course, but we don't know if that question prompted this to be covered or it was in the initial plan to cover this topic or this subject.
So, the reason I brought this up was this whole idea of, can we outsource podcast generation? Do we really need to spend hours curating this stuff if we can just pop it into an AI? But what's the verdict, at least at this time point? What do you think? Think we're out of a job?
I think it's a great supplement, especially for like guiding your own education. But part of the reason that, I avidly listened to this podcast before I'm now on it is I really appreciated you being able to select these people that I've never heard of, talk about these things I've never heard of, provide ideas I've never heard of. And just like that kind of guiding hand or selection of content, I think is invaluable. And then just your own personal experience and preferences, those things are huge and really helps wade through this huge swath of information that would be otherwise hit with.
Yeah, I honestly don't know. I think that right now my answer is no, but who knows in 2 years what will happen. The main problem with Notebook LM and things like that is these are all automated and they have a black box or information extraction algorithm that we don't know actually, we can't control. And if I give it the same content and you, Cody, and Ali, and Paul give it the same content, we'll get 4 different versions or 4 different narratives. And there are infinite possibilities with infinite number of inaccuracies in them. So there needs to be some oversight if we want to say, okay, now this is a valid podcast. This is curated podcast. It's not a random thing that someone clapped up. I think that is something that needs some work at least. But I really like the idea of scaling the podcast to more topics. I can't say guests, definitely, but more topics and more works.
That's really interesting. There's this podcast I listened to called No Stupid Questions by Angela Duckworth. She is a psychology professor at the University of Pennsylvania who's famous for a book called Grit. And at the end of every episode, they actually have a fact check. So they have dedicated staff, and they basically check what Angela Duckworth and her guest said and said, hey, Angela misspoke. This was actually incorrect. The quote that she meant to say was actually from Dr. So-and-so, not Dr. whoever she said. I think that's actually pretty interesting, right? If we think about human podcasts, I'm sure throughout the months and years that I've said some things that are incorrect, maybe I've never gotten fact checked on it. So maybe there is a way that we can scale using AI, and we have these fact checking that we're already doing for at least some of the podcasts.
Use AI to fact check this podcast or any AI generated podcast, AI for AI. But really, but jokes aside, I think that it'd be really hard to make an argument at this time to just pass on any episode that's generated without any human review or any expert review, rather. I mean, Paul, I feel like you and I would probably have to be really carefully looking at every single episode that's created by AI tool, for example, or we made it publicly available. What I'm hearing, Bardia, is that we have 2 more years to keep this job. So rest assured we can kind of sit back a little relaxed in our chairs.
Or to quote our outgoing RSNA president, Kurt Langlotz, AI will not replace podcast hosts, but podcast hosts who use AI will replace those who don't.
But I think the academic podcast landscape will change in the upcoming years. And then the real human generated podcast will be more like giving you a perspective, going into long, deep conversations with the authors and the people in the field rather than just covering the work, because that part can be automated pretty easily. So I'm very excited for that future. I really like these deep dive, not deep dive in terms of the Notebook LM, but deep dive podcasts that go into a topic for many, many minutes or even hours.
I would happen to agree with that. I think, depending on what somebody's looking for, this kind of like swap between like people versus information and what you're going after. And within the same podcast, you can even have different series for what you're looking for. I think serving both of those needs will probably be the podcast that ultimately survive.
Speaking of what we're excited about for the future, as we wrap up our podcast here, by the way, this is not an AI generated podcast for our listeners. This has all been authentic, live, in the moment. What are we excited about for the future? What's next?
Well, I'll tell you something I played around with. I stuck a SAMP radiology report from the internet, so publicly available, and it was pretty amazing, honestly. I mean, me as a radiologist, and maybe it didn't explain it in terms that I needed, but it was describing things like, what we considered like heliectasis, which is basically like when the renal collecting system, or for those of you who aren't radiologists, it's where your urine collects in the kidney. It gets bigger And that sometimes signifies that you might have a blockage somewhere between your kidney and your bladder. And the way to describe it was just like that. You've got like a water pipe and you might have a clog, and this is going to cause a backflow. And it turned something that could be very dry on one hand, but also, frankly, a little bit traumatizing into something that was both accessible and entertaining because they were like, well, this is what they see, but they don't see a mass or a stone. So that's good news. And the important thing here is that this scan was done for cancer and there's no signs of cancer. So things are looking really great. And then they go into this whole spiel about empowering patients and giving them hope and optimism. And, I thought that was pretty interesting. Like literally just from a radiology report. It didn't say anything about, hey, this is a person who has a real life, who has hopes and aspirations and dreams. It's literally like evaluate for some malignancy or cancer on an MRI. And so that to me, I think could be a future where, especially when radiologists are talking about doing things like patient consultations, multimedia radiology reports, and as patients are getting access to reports, right, through things like Epic MyChart, I think that podcasting could be a real way to bridge that gap, to make it more accessible and speak in a language that's going to be one, understandable, but two, be frankly more engaging.
Can you imagine the Press Ganey scores that podcast host received? And that's the thing. I think once we start seeing unique and really high impact, high value use cases like this, just making sure we have those quality frameworks in place, right? Making sure that if there are patients submitting radiology reports or other clinical notes or other sort of medical documentation, that hopefully it's done in a regulated environment where if they have questions or if there's an error, it's detected and it's actually taken to someone who may be able to see through the hallucination versus someone who may not have an option, but just to believe what's presented to them because it's more than that individual may have experience with or prior knowledge with.
Yeah. I mean, something I'm super excited about this is like the democratization, I'm not pronouncing that word correctly, aspect of it where, the accessibility that this creates for podcasts or just changing things from different formats, whether it be you're not able to read different papers or something like that, but you can listen to them for whatever reason, maybe like legally blind or something like that at all, or just converting it to a different language. This could really make like high quality content with people who have the expertise to curate these things in a way to know they're accurate to people all around the world. And I think that's just better for the world, better for every society.
And I'm very excited about a future that we have more control knobs on Notebook LM to tune it for different people, different understanding, and a truly individualized learning or educational experience. I mean, that would be very exciting.
Well, on that note, I think that's a pretty positive place to take a short break here until our next conversation on this topic. I know our Trinity of the Toe Board members and our new assistant podcast editors have quite a bit in store on this topic and others coming forward in the coming months to years. So with that short teaser there, I think let's go ahead and call it a night. It's been great speaking to each and every one of you. Great seeing you all. Cody and Bardia, welcome again to not just the Trinity Editorial Board, but to the Radiology Artificial Intelligence podcast. Paul and I are so excited to have you both and our other assistant podcast editors on board here to create some new exciting content, and we'll see where this goes.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Radiology Artificial Intelligence podcast. Shout out to Yuri Ishimchisen for our podcast music and to the RSNA podcast staff.
Email us at podcasts@rsna.org anytime with questions, feedback, or suggestions.